Ridley Scott is the director of such classic films as Alien, Blade Runner, Thelma and Louise, and more recently Gladiator. So when I heard that Scott, who is a self-described atheist, had been given $140 million to film a biblical Exodus story, my curiosity was piqued. It's been almost 60 years since Cecil B. DeMille's The Ten Commandments, so we were probably due for an update using 21st century technology. How many of you have seen the trailer for the new Exodus movie? Anybody? Okay, so a few of you have seen the trailer. Anyone seen the film? Okay, it just came out on Thursday night, so I'm not surprised. Now, I'll get into whether you should or not. We'll talk about that. Now, if you, like me, are a huge religion nerd, then this film is perhaps worth your $12 to go in the evening. But be forewarned, while this film, while not terrible, is not a masterpiece. According to the website Rotten Tomatoes, only 28% of critics and 45% of audience members have given it a positive review. That's not good, if you were wondering. That's out of 100%. Megan, my wife, would tell you to skip Exodus and instead see the film Wild, which is based on Cheryl Strayed's widely praised memoir, which is getting 92% approval ratings. How many of you have read Wild? It's really a powerful book. It's honestly a story of a woman's journey of self-discovery that is much better than Eat, Pray, Love. So don't think that's what you're getting. And if you like that book, that's fine too. But the one critic described it as a really powerful story of a woman's journey of self-discovery in the wilderness when a man isn't chasing after her with a chainsaw. So it's really worth considering. I'll say more about the Exodus film later, but first allow me to situate us a little historically. In Genesis, the first book of the Bible, the ancestral legends of Abraham and Sarah and Hagar, of Rebekah and Isaac, of Jacob and Leah, Zilpah, Rachel, and Bilhah. Again, those traditional biblical values are a little more complicated than is often acknowledged. Those ancestral stories are set about 4,000 years ago, which would date the so-called historical Abraham to around 2000 BCE. It's about the time the pyramids are being built, a little before for the pyramids. And the famine in Canaan, which led the Israelites to Egypt looking for food, that would have been around 1700 BCE, so they went to Egypt in search of food and then were enslaved for 400 years. And the Exodus would have been around 1300 BCE. Now, I'm taking some time this morning to give a shout out for biblical literacy because of the tremendous impact the Bible has had and continues to have on our history and on our culture. In particular, scholars have argued that Exodus may be the single most important and influential book of the Bible, both for better and for worse. Many early American settlers understood when they thought about, and when you heard preachers preach about the move, the flight from Europe and the settlement in America, they explicitly talked about it as a new Exodus. Later, Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson recommended that the Great Seal of the United States, this didn't happen, but they recommended that it depict Moses leading the Israelites across the parted sea as a symbol of the American experience. The shadow side of this view, of course, is that if the incoming Europeans were the Israelites, then who were the new Canaanites? The American Indians, right? And that theology helped justify the mistreatment of the indigenous groups. African Americans in the U.S., hoping for freedom in the 19th century and fighting for civil rights in the 20th century, likewise saw themselves in a much more positive way as reliving the Israelite experience. In the 1970s and 80s, the mass departure of hundreds of thousands of Jews from the Soviet Union was known as Operation Exodus. That's just a few of the major examples of the influence that Exodus has had throughout history. And the power of this archetypal story to inspire liberation movements continues today. And although the basic story of freedom from oppression is told in Scott's new film, perhaps my biggest disappointment is that the movie does not fulfill the promise of its subtitle, Exodus, Gods and Kings, plural gods and plural kings. At the core of the Exodus story really is a conflict between competing deities, between the Hebrew tribal god Yahweh versus the Egyptian gods, and of course one of the Egyptian gods is Pharaoh as divine. But the story's actually a lot more interesting to me and complicated than that, and I hope to you. We'll see. Although we've come to think of Judaism as a monotheistic religion, Judaism did not definitively affirm the existence of only one God until the mid-6th century BCE, around the time of the Babylonian exile, more than 700 years after the Exodus from Egypt. Before then, Israelite religion was what is known as henotheistic, H-E-N-O. So instead of monotheistic, it was henotheistic, the worship of one God without denying the existence of other gods. The Greek word heis and the Greek word monos, they can both mean one, but heis has the connotation of one, so that's where we get henotheism, as in a sequence, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and monos has that connotation of one, as in single or alone. So that's monotheism. Listen for the henotheism in these 3 Bible verses. So I'll just give you 3 examples. The first is Exodus 20, 2-3. You all brought your Bibles this morning, right? Follow along with me. Exodus 20, 2-3. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. Some of you may can think of this in your head. You shall have no other gods before me. Do you hear the henotheism there? Deuteronomy 32, 8 and 9. When the Most High apportioned the nation, when he divided humankind, he fixed the boundaries of the people according to the number of gods. The Lord's own portion was his people. Jacob was allotted his share. Remember, Jacob was renamed Israel. Jacob wrestled with God on Genesis 32. It's in there, I promise. You can check it out next time you go to a hotel room and open the drawer. So Jacob wrestled with an angel. His name was changed to Israel. Again, you hear the henotheism there, that Yahweh was apportioned among the gods. Final example, Joshua 24, 2 and 15. Joshua said to all the people, "Thus says the Lord God of Israel, long ago your ancestors lived beyond the Euphrates, and they served other gods. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." Do you hear the henotheism? It's not till you get to like 2nd Isaiah in the post-exile that you get the prophet saying definitively, there is only God, there is only one. You don't get that early on in the Hebrew Bible. And I say this regularly when I teach the Bible, that a close reading of the Bible will blow your mind. When you actually read it for what it says, not for what you think it says, or when you just actually read it. I'm fairly convinced that most people who say they want to return to biblical values have never actually read most of the Bible. I'm really pretty sure about that. I'll give you just one more example of the untapped potential of that subtitle, Exodus, Gods, and Kings. It turns out that Yahweh, who is depicted as male, had a female consort named Asherah. So while Jesus likely did not have a wife, it turns out that God did. Yahweh and Asherah were a very popular divine couple prior to the religious changes introduced by King Uzziah around 622 BCE. I'll have to save details for a future sermon, but in addition to the archaeological evidence for Asherah, of which there is quite a bit, there are 6 direct references to Asherah worship in the Bible in 1st and 2nd Kings. I will not go through those right now, but I will explicitly put them in a footnote to this sermon that we'll post on our website. All that to say, I would have been a lot happier with Ridley Scott's film if he had explored some more of the full implications of those gods and kings. But he did at least give me a good excuse to begin to share some of that history with you. So I would be remiss as well if I failed to address what some of today's best biblical scholarship has to say about separating myth from legend in the Exodus story, drawing on the work of one of my favorite biblical scholars, whose work I would commend to you, the emeritus Harvard professor James Kugel. That's K-U-G-E-L, like the dessert. If any of you have Jewish friends or the Jewish family members or are Jewish, you may know of Kugel. It's spelled like that. James Kugel is an Orthodox Jew, but he's also spent a career teaching the historical interpretation of the Bible at Harvard. So he's lived in a really interesting tension. He's a really fascinating scholar. He has an excellent book called How to Read the Bible, and there he writes that there may well be a kernel of historical truth. Now that kernel of historical truth has gotten butter added over time, and some salt and some flavoring, and it's gotten popped in the heat of the vagaries of history. But there may well be a kernel of historical truth in the Exodus account. It may be that the story was originally much more localized and involved far fewer people, perhaps only a small band of escapees from Egyptian servitude. The Exodus theme is especially prominent in the northern, so you have the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. The northern Israelite texts have a whole lot of the Exodus stuff, much more so than the southern texts. There's so much to say about this. For example, like Jacob, remember Jacob, I listed all his wives. The northern Israelite texts are the ones that he had with Joseph, who was the son that got sold into slavery in Egypt. And so Joseph and Benjamin are full brothers, and those are the tribes that, so it would make sense that they would perpetuate those because they're the ones that had the most vested interest in preserving the Joseph accounts. All right, there's a lot more to say, but I'll leave it there. So that they're a lot more prominent in the northern Israelite text. So for that reason, some have supposed, and this is a fairly standard scholarly argument, that the whole Exodus tradition was originally found only among some members of one of the northern tribes. But after David, and that's around 1000, so Exodus 1300, King David around 1000, after David succeeded in uniting the 12 tribes under his one flag, this formerly local bit of history may have become the common heritage and a common story told among all the tribes. Certainly such a turn of events would not be paralleled. After all, Americans of many generations have been taught in school about our Pilgrim Fathers who came over on the Mayflower and our Founding Fathers, whereas the overwhelming majority of Americans could hardly be said to actually descend genetically from this idealized ancestral group. It is not hard to imagine, scholars say, that a similarly pious theme of the Exodus story came to be transferred from the experience of a few to the founding myth of an entire nation. And scholars tell us that what follows from this insight is of there being no mass exodus from Egypt is that the Israelites were always already in Canaan. That the Israelites are Canaanites. They're part of that broad Canaanite umbrella. Joshua, Moses' successor, did not lead an invasion from the outside. Instead, there was in all likelihood an internal insurrection within Canaan in which one group of Canaanites who worshipped a god named Yahweh came to dominate the land. To limit myself to just one among many pieces of evidence for this theory, you can see many more in Kugel's book. The word El, so when we talk about Israel, E-L, or Emmanuel, or Samuel, you hear all thoseEls and all those biblical names. That word El is the name for the Canaanite supreme deity. So when you look at the older pre-Israelite Canaanite text, El is the Canaanite supreme god. So it seems in all likelihood Israel's god was a development of the head of the pre-Israelite Canaanite pantheon. Some of you may know the word syncretism. Syncretism just means the ways that religions all borrow from and influence one another. And the history of religions show us that it's all syncretism all the way down. In our current holiday season, the obvious pagan, non-biblical roots of the Christmas tree, the choice of celebrating Jesus' birth on the winter solstice are just two prime examples that are relevant right now of the pervasive influence of religious syncretism. For now, I'll conclude with a few words about the continued relevance of the Exodus archetypal story, even for today. To do so, it's important to name that the best reason not to see Ridley Scott's new film, new version of the Exodus story, is the incredibly racist casting, which is ironic since it's a story about liberation from slavery. All of the main characters were cast and given to white people. Moses is white and played by Christian Bale, so it turns out that Moses is also Batman. But that's perhaps an improvement from Charlton Heston, but that's a separate story. Pharaoh is white. Tuya, Pharaoh's mother, with a shout out to Alien, is played by Sigourney Weaver, who in this film is super white. They did not give her tan. Joshua is Jesse Pinkman from Breaking Bad. And so not only are these characters who are supposed to be African white, they are not even remotely tan. As commentator David Dennis said, the only thing black about the main cast is their eyeliner. Far more disturbingly, not only are all the main characters cast as white, but the servants, the thieves, and the assassins are all played by Africans. It's like, seriously? In 2014? Even worse, when called out, Ridley Scott said, "I can't mount a film of this budget when I have to rely on tax rebates from Spain and say that my lead actor is Mohammed so-and-so from such and such." This is a verbatim quote. "I'm just not going to get it financed, so the question doesn't even come up." So you may want to save your money and see Wild, or save your money and see the film Selma. That's a very important film that's getting much more positive reviews. That's coming out Christmas Day, the new film about MLK that looks quite powerful. Nevertheless, as we reflected earlier, there are many ways in which the Exodus archetype influenced the civil rights movement, casting Dr. King in a powerful way as a new Moses. And as we near the 50th anniversary of the March from Selma to Montgomery and work to discern our role in the continuing struggle for racial justice in our country, if you haven't seen it, I recommend that you read, and this is free on the internet, the really insightful interview by Chris Rock with Frank Rich in one of the recent issues of New York Magazine. Have any of you seen that? Really a powerful interview. In thinking about the Exodus story, as I was reading this interview with Chris Rock, the following paragraph really stood out to me. Rock said, "When we talk about race relations in America or racial progress, it's all nonsense. There are no race relations. White people were crazy, now they're not as crazy. To say that black people have made progress would be to say that they deserve what happened to them before. So to say that Obama is progress is saying that he's the first black person that was qualified to be president. That's not black progress, that's white progress. There have been black people qualified to be president for hundreds of years." Rock continued, and keep in mind at this point that he's a comedian. He said, "If you saw Tina Turner and Ike having a lovely breakfast across the room for you, would you say that their relationship has improved? Some people would, but a smart people would say, oh, he stopped punching her in the face. That's not improvement. It's not up to her. You know, my kids are smart," Rock continued. "They're smart, they're educated, they're beautiful, polite children. And there have been smart, educated, beautiful, polite black children for hundreds of years. The advantage that my children have is that they are encountering the nicest white people that America has ever produced. Let's hope America keeps producing nicer white people." And part of producing nicer white people is continuing to raise awareness about the ongoing systemic racism and the white privilege that is undue in our world. It means taking the time to read vitally important books, and I've heard back from a number of you that have in the last few weeks read Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration and an Age of Colorblindness. I also recommend the work of Tim Wise, such as his book, White Like Me, Reflections on Race from a Privileged Son. He makes important points like loss of privilege is not the same as reverse discrimination and many other things like that. Or if you can make the time to read only one article, if you don't have the time right now to read a full book, I challenge you to read Ta-Nehisi Coates' devastating article in The Atlantic, The Case for Reparations. And as you read it, don't assume that you know what he's going to say beforehand. Ta-Nehisi Coates, The Case for Reparations. All such anti-racist, anti-oppressive resources point us toward what it means for today to learn from the Exodus archetype of communal liberation from oppression. In that spirit, I will end for now with a reflection adapted from a recent message from my colleague, the Reverend Rosemary Bray McNatt. She was one of the first African-American women admitted into Yale. She's a UU minister. She was recently appointed as the president of Starr King School for the Ministry, our West Coast UU seminary. McNatt writes, "At this time of holy unrest, may we find the peace that comes when we know why we struggle and what we struggle for. For we serve the great cause of justice and not ourselves. May we find a true joy in the community we form each time we gather to worship, to march, to interrupt ordinary time to create sacred time, a time to help others awaken to what is so very wrong in our world. May we help one another to be kind, even to those with whom we struggle. And in the raising of our voices and the marching of our feet, may we be agents of a radical love that holds us all. And finally, may we be grateful. Grateful to live in these times when great works of justice await our hands and our hearts and our minds and our spirits. May our time together prepare us so that we might do all that is in our power to change this world, so the beloved community may be born, not tomorrow, but today.